Today's story is about a near-death experience, NDE, where a man shares his powerful journey after facing the brink of death. If you enjoy these kinds of stories, be sure to leave a like, subscribe, and hit the notification bell so you don't miss out. Now, let's dive into his incredible testimony. My name is Elijah, and I was born into a world that constantly reminded me of who I was before I even understood myself. As a black man in America, I faced struggles that were part of my daily existence. But my family was my anchor, particularly my mother, who raised me with unwavering faith in Islam. I grew up surrounded by the prayers, the discipline, and the sense of community that my religion provided. Every morning, before the sun had a chance to fully rise, I would kneel on my prayer mat, facing Mecca, and whisper the verses of the Quran that I had memorized since childhood. It gave me peace, grounding me in a world that often felt chaotic and hostile. I knew who I was, or at least I thought I did. My faith in Allah was firm. My family's lineage traced back to African Muslims brought to this land in chains, and this history, though painful, was one I carried with pride. I believed in the teachings of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, and I sought to live by the pillars of Islam in every aspect of my life. The mosque became my second home, a place where I felt safe and understood, where the struggles of being black and Muslim in a country that saw neither with respect were shared. But the world outside was different. In America, being black carried a weight that was impossible to ignore, and being Muslim only made that burden heavier. I heard the whispers, the sideways glances, the suspicions. My faith and my skin were judged before I had a chance to speak. But even with all of that, I held my head high. My belief in Allah and my devotion to my family gave me strength. Life, I thought, was hard but manageable, and my path was clear. Until the day it wasn't. It was just another day. I had been driving back home after visiting a close friend. The evening sky was painted with shades of red and purple as the sun set on the horizon. I was lost in thought, reflecting on a conversation we'd had about life, faith, and the struggles of being black men in America. The roads were empty, save for the occasional car that passed by. I had no idea that my life was about to take a drastic turn. The crash came out of nowhere. A blinding flash of headlights, the screeching of tires, the violent impact. In an instant, my world flipped upside down. The sound of metal crunching and glass shattering filled my ears as my body was thrown violently against the seatbelt. I could feel my consciousness slipping as the car spun out of control. My heart pounded, but everything else slowed. Time, it seemed, had no meaning in that moment. I don't remember the exact second my heart stopped, but I remember the silence that followed. It wasn't the kind of silence you hear in the world. It was deeper, more profound. Suddenly, I was no longer in my body. I was above it, looking down at the wreckage of my car, the twisted metal, and the crumpled body that was me. I watched as paramedics worked frantically to revive me. It was strange, watching them try so hard to bring me back, but feeling so detached. I floated there, outside of myself, weightless and calm. There was no pain, no fear, just this overwhelming sense of peace, as if all the worries, all the pressures of my life had melted away. I didn't know what was happening. I didn't know if this was death, but it felt serene. It wasn't frightening. It was as if I was being pulled gently towards something, somewhere far from the chaos of that crash. As I drifted further away from my body, I found myself in a place that I can only describe as a vast, endless desert. It wasn't the kind of desert with sand and heat that you might picture, but rather a spiritual emptiness, a place that was neither here nor there, just nothingness. The sky above was an endless gray, and the ground beneath me seemed more like a suggestion than something solid. I stood there, or perhaps I floated, and for the first time, I felt truly alone. The peace I had felt moments earlier began to fade, replaced by a quiet, gnawing uncertainty. I had always been so sure of my path, my faith, but now I wasn't so certain. My mind, my heart, they were filled with questions. I had always been taught that death would lead to paradise for the faithful, but this place, this desolate, uninhabited space, didn't feel like the paradise I had envisioned. As I wandered through this spiritual desert, I found myself reflecting on the life I had lived and, more profoundly, on the doubts I had suppressed over the years. I thought about my faith in Islam, my devotion to Allah, and how that faith had always been a source of strength. But there was always something that didn't sit right with me, a tension I didn't speak of openly. I began to think about the conversations I had had with others, particularly with those who questioned Islam and its place in the Black community. There had been so many debates about religion, Christianity in particular, and how it had been used as a tool of oppression against Black people. The history of slavery in America, the way Christianity was forced upon my ancestors, made me deeply distrustful of it. I couldn't reconcile how a religion that preached love and salvation had been weaponized to justify the chains that bound my people. These thoughts weighed on me as I continued through the desert. Was I here because I had doubted? Because I had questioned whether any faith, Islam, Christianity, or otherwise, could truly save us from the suffering in this world? In the stillness of that spiritual desert, my thoughts turned darker, more conflicted. I couldn't stop replaying the countless arguments I had with friends, with family, and even within myself about Christianity. As a Black man, the history of that religion had always made me uneasy. I'd seen how Christianity was used to control and subjugate, how it was forced upon slaves as a way to keep them compliant. How could I trust a faith that had been twisted to justify the bondage of my ancestors? I remembered the conversations I had with my uncle, a staunch Christian who had embraced the religion wholeheartedly. Elijah, he'd say, "You're seeing it all wrong. Jesus didn't enslave our people, men did. It's not the faith, it's what people did in its name." But I wasn't convinced. How could the symbol of a cross, the same one that hung over plantation doors, ever represent freedom to me? I found myself shouting into the vast emptiness around me. Where was Jesus when my ancestors cried out for salvation? Where was he when they were beaten, when they were sold? The words echoed back to me, unanswered. The memories continued to swirl. I thought about how I had distanced myself from Christianity, how I had sought solace in Islam, a religion that felt more connected to my roots, my history. But now, in this desolate place, those same feelings of distrust began to bubble up again. Was any religion capable of holding truth? Or were they all just tools, used and misused by men to control one another? As I wrestled with these thoughts, I began to feel a weight in my chest, a heaviness I couldn't shake. My anger turned inward, and I started questioning everything. My faith, my beliefs, even my own identity. Who was I, really? Was I just a man trying to hold on to something, anything, in a world that never seemed to care? Was I just another lost soul, wandering in the desert? As I stood there, lost in the desert of my thoughts, something began to shift in the air around me. The dull grayness that stretched out endlessly started to change. A soft, warm light appeared in the distance. It wasn't blinding, but gentle, like the sun rising over the horizon after a long night. I could feel its warmth, not just on my skin, but deep within my soul. For a moment, the heaviness in my chest lifted. At first, I wasn't sure what I was seeing. The figure that approached wasn't the pale, blue-eyed Jesus I had seen in countless church windows and paintings. No, this man had skin the color of the earth, deep and rich, like mine. His hair was thick and dark, his presence calm and commanding. He walked toward me, but it felt less like walking and more like he was simply there, closing the distance between us without effort. My heart pounded, not out of fear, but out of a strange anticipation. I had spent years rejecting this figure, pushing him away, associating him with pain and oppression. And yet, here he was, standing before me. He looked at me with eyes that radiated understanding, eyes that seemed to see into the very core of my being, eyes that knew my struggles, my doubts, my anger. I wanted to speak, to question, to challenge him like I had done in my mind so many times before. But I couldn't. The words just wouldn't come. Then he spoke, and his voice was unlike anything I had ever heard. It wasn't commanding, but it carried authority. It wasn't loud, but it resonated deep within me. "Elijah," he said, calling me by name, as if we had always known each other. "I understand your pain. I understand your anger." His voice was full of compassion, and in that moment, all the walls I had built up over the years began to crumble. This was not the Jesus of the plantation sermons. This was not the Jesus used to justify oppression. This was something else, someone else, someone who seemed to know the depths of my soul in a way no one else ever had. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at him, my mind racing. How could he understand? How could he know the pain that my people had carried for centuries? I wanted to lash out, to ask him the questions that had haunted me for years. But before I could say a word, he spoke again, as if he could hear the turmoil inside me. "Elijah," he began, his voice still soft but carrying the weight of eternity. "I know what was done in my name. I know the pain, the suffering, the chains that were put upon your people. But that was not my will. That was never my will." He stepped closer, and as he did, I felt an overwhelming sense of calm wash over me, like the weight I had been carrying for so long was slowly being lifted. His words cut through the noise in my mind, the anger and the confusion. "Men have twisted my words," he continued, "used my name for their own purposes, for power, for control. But I did not come for that. I came to set people free. Free from their chains, free from their sins, free from the lies they tell themselves." I felt tears welling up in my eyes, but I didn't fight them. I had spent so many years holding on to this anger, this distrust. It had shaped who I was, how I saw the world. But now, standing in front of this man, this Jesus who was not the figure I had been taught to fear or distrust, it all felt so small, so insignificant. "But why, Jesus?" I finally found my voice, though it trembled as I spoke. "Why didn't you stop it? Why didn't you stop the suffering?" He looked at me with a sadness that seemed to reach into the very depths of his soul. "Elijah, the suffering in this world is not of my making. It is the consequence of human choices, the brokenness of a world that has turned away from me. But I have always been there, waiting, ready to heal, to restore." He paused, and I could feel the gravity of his words sinking in. "I did not come to bring more chains, Elijah. I came to break them." I stood there, the weight of his words pressing into me, softening the sharp edges of my anger. Jesus, this Jesus who understood my pain, continued to speak, and every word felt like it was unraveling years of confusion, bitterness, and doubt. "Elijah," he said, his eyes never leaving mine, "I know what it is to suffer. I know what it means to bear the sins of others. When I carried the cross, I carried not only the sins of those who put me there, but the sins of all humanity. I bore the pain of every person who has ever felt abandoned, oppressed, or forgotten." His words hung in the air, heavy with truth. I had always seen the cross as a symbol of oppression, a tool used to justify the enslavement of my ancestors. But now, hearing him speak, I realized that the cross was something different entirely. It wasn't just a symbol of death and suffering. It was a symbol of love, of sacrifice. He had carried it, not to impose more chains, but to break them. He gestured toward his hands, and I saw the scars, deep, raw, and real. "These scars," he said, "are a reminder of the price I paid, not for a select few, but for all. I came for the oppressed, for the downtrodden, for those who have been cast aside by the world. I came for you." I felt a lump rise in my throat. "But what about my people?" I asked, my voice small, trembling. "What about the generations of suffering? How can we believe in redemption when we've been taught to see religion as a weapon?" Jesus stepped closer, and I could feel the warmth of his presence. "Your people," he said, "have been through unspeakable pain. But redemption is not about forgetting the past. It's about healing from it. My love is not bound by the actions of those who used my name for evil. I see the suffering, and I grieve for it. But I offer healing, not just for the soul, but for the heart, for the wounds that have been inflicted for generations." He paused and then gently said, "Look to my cross, Elijah. It's not a symbol of oppression. It's a symbol of the ultimate sacrifice, a sacrifice made out of love for all people. I carried it so that no one else would have to carry their burdens alone." As I stood there, the warmth of Jesus' words sinking into the depths of my soul, something began to shift inside me. The anger, the distrust, the confusion, all of it began to melt away, replaced by something I hadn't felt in a long time: peace. It wasn't the peace that comes from having all the answers, but a peace that came from knowing that I wasn't alone in my struggles, that I wasn't carrying the weight of the world on my own shoulders. For so long, I had seen faith as something divisive, something that had been used to control and oppress. But now, standing before Jesus, I realized that true faith wasn't about control. It wasn't about power. It was about love. It was about surrender, not to a system, not to a history of pain, but to a God who saw me, who understood my pain, and who wanted to heal it. Tears streamed down my face, but I didn't try to stop them. I felt like years of hurt and doubt were being washed away in that moment. Jesus reached out to me, and though I couldn't feel his touch physically, I felt it deep within my heart. It was as if he was pulling me up from the depths of despair, lifting me out of the desert of doubt and into the light of understanding. "Elijah," he said softly, "you don't have to carry this burden anymore. You don't have to question your worth or your place in this world. You are loved. You have always been loved. The suffering you've endured, the pain your people have carried, it matters. And I see it. But I offer you freedom. I offer you healing." In that moment, I felt a choice before me. I could continue down the path of bitterness, holding on to my anger, my distrust. Or I could let it all go and embrace the love that Jesus was offering me. I could let him take the weight off my shoulders and lead me into something new, something real. I didn't need to think twice. "I surrender," I whispered, my voice cracking. "I surrender, Jesus." In that instant, I felt a wave of peace, deeper and more profound than anything I had ever experienced. It was as if the chains that had bound my heart for so long had been broken, and I was finally free. I wasn't turning my back on my past or my people. I was finding a new way forward, a way that was rooted in love, not pain. The peace that filled me was like nothing I had ever known. It felt eternal, as if I had stepped into a place beyond time, beyond pain. But then, slowly, I felt myself being pulled back. It was subtle at first, a distant sensation, like the faint sound of my name being called from far away. I wanted to stay in that place with Jesus, where everything was clear, where love was the only thing that mattered. But someone, was calling me back. The world around me began to shift, and I felt a jolt, a sudden force dragging me from that spiritual realm. It was as if I was being drawn back into my body, and with it came the sensations I had forgotten. The pain, the noise, the confusion. My eyes fluttered open, and the harsh fluorescent lights of a hospital room came into focus. The sterile smell of antiseptic filled my nostrils. I could hear the beeping of machines and the faint murmurs of voices. "Elijah, Elijah." My mother's voice broke through the haze. Her face, streaked with tears, came into view as she leaned over me, gripping my hand tightly. "Thank God," she whispered, her voice trembling with relief. "Thank God you're awake." I blinked, trying to process where I was, what had happened. The accident, the crash, it all came rushing back. My body felt heavy, aching from the trauma, but my mind was still reeling from the experience I had just been through. Had it been real? Had I really met Jesus? Or was it all some kind of dream, a hallucination brought on by the brink of death? But deep down, I knew it wasn't a dream. The peace I had felt, the words Jesus had spoken to me, they were real. They had changed me in a way that I couldn't fully explain, but I knew I would never be the same again. The doctor came in, checking my vitals, speaking in hushed tones to the nurses. "You're lucky to be alive, Elijah," he said, his voice a mix of awe and disbelief. "We almost lost you. Your heart stopped for several minutes, but somehow you came back." I looked at my mother, her tear-filled eyes staring into mine, and I squeezed her hand. I was back, but I was different. I had been given a second chance, not just at life, but at understanding the deeper truths that had been hidden from me for so long. In the weeks that followed my return to life, I found myself grappling with how to put into words the transformation I had experienced. How could I explain to people, my family, my friends, that everything I thought I knew about faith, about God, had been turned upside down in those brief moments between life and death? I knew that most would look at me with disbelief, and some might even mock me for speaking of Jesus in a way that conflicted with what I had once held so dear. But the experience had been too profound to keep to myself. I had to share what I had learned, what I had felt, with those around me. I started by telling my mother, who listened with wide eyes as I described the spiritual desert, my encounter with Jesus, and the love I had found in surrendering to him. She sat quietly, holding my hand as I spoke. When I finished, she wiped a tear from her cheek and whispered, "I always prayed that you'd find peace, Elijah. Maybe this was your answer." Encouraged by her response, I began to open up to others in my community, though cautiously at first. I spoke to my close friends, the ones who had shared the same skepticism about Christianity, the same frustrations about how religion had been used against our people. I told them about my anger, my doubts, and how Jesus had spoken to those exact wounds, offering healing and love instead of judgment. Some listened intently, their faces unreadable, while others couldn't hide their disbelief. "You're telling me Jesus came to you? That he's the answer?" One of my friends asked, his tone skeptical. "Man, we've been down this road before. Religion's always been used to keep us in check." "I know," I replied, my voice steady but filled with conviction. That's exactly what I thought too. But this wasn't the Jesus they preach about. This was someone who understood our pain. Someone who didn't deny the suffering but offered a way through it, not around it. Slowly, word began to spread about my experience. People from the mosque, from the neighborhood, came to hear my story. It wasn't easy, and I knew that some viewed me with suspicion or even anger for embracing a message that many saw as contradictory to our shared history. But I couldn't deny the truth of what I had experienced. Standing before the community, I shared my testimony. I know the history of oppression. I know what religion has done to our people. But I also know what I experienced. An encounter with love, with grace, with a Savior who wasn't about chains or oppression, but about breaking them. Jesus carried that cross, not to subjugate, but to set us free. Some nodded in understanding, others remained silent, but I didn't need everyone to believe me. I had found my peace, my truth, and that was enough. My journey, which had begun in faith, taken me through doubt, and led me back to love, wasn't just about finding religion. It was about finding hope, finding freedom. And now, I knew that I had to live differently, to love differently, because I had been given a second chance. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and watch this next story. It's truly exciting.